If we can't get excited about what's happening right now, then we got to have our pulse checked or something. These are exciting times. They're fascinating times. History is going to be written about the times that we're living in right now. It really is tremendous. The title that we've got up here, Are We Not a State? Comes from 1857. It's a paraphrase from 1857. Dred Scott stood before the Supreme Court and he said, "Am I not a man?" And the Supreme Court in 1857 said, "Not really, no you're not." Now fortunately times changed, and that changed. But at that time he stood before the Supreme Court and said, "No, you're not." Well, our question is, are we not a state in Utah? Are we not a state in the western states? And that's what we want to talk about. If you hit the next slide. What led me to this, as I got into the state legislature and started looking at the budget, I knew that there was an issue of federal money. We know that if you take the money, you take the strings. You see it in education all the time. I wanted to know, how dependent are we? As I got into the audits and looking through that, $5.2 billion of our $12 billion state budget is federally sourced funds. Go ahead and hit the next. And so what we know is, knowing the nature of the federal financial, fiscal, and monetary condition, we know the reliability of that $5.2 billion is somewhat suspect. If we're not deeply concerned about the reliability of that, we should maybe have an examination or something. There are serious issues. What we know also from the debt ceiling discussions that happened last August, we increased the debt ceiling $1.4 trillion and then said, let's have a super committee. And if the super committee fails, then what we'll do is we'll have what's called sequestration. That means we'll cut the budget across the board 9%. Well, the super committee obviously failed. I think it was designed to fail. It was never intended to succeed. They set it up so they could all have plausible deniability. Hey, we didn't vote for that. The super committee didn't do their job, and look, it failed, so now we've got 9% across the board cuts. So what we know is coming already. Out of the $5.2 billion, we know we're facing 9% across the board cuts. We're going to see some substantial portion of that go away immediately. Now here, I'm going to show you about a 2-minute video clip, and this is Erskine Bowles, okay? Erskine Bowles, some of you may know, he was... Oh.
But this one is really easy to see.
Yeah, just swipe backwards and it should, and then do it again and it'll actually swipe the other way. Yeah, do that again and then one more time and you should get there. There we go. Okay, so Erskine Bowles, some of you may know, was the chief of staff for President Bill Clinton. He was named by President Obama as the co-chair of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission. We've got these big debts, we've got deficits, what are we going to do about it? Let's have a commission. He appoints Erskine Bowles as the Democrat representative of the co-chair. The Republican co-chair is Alan Simpson, former senator from Wyoming. This is the report that they gave to the Senate Budget Committee last March. So almost a year ago. Pay attention to the dates that he points out. So this is about a 2-minute video clip.
Last crisis as it came upon us. But this one is really easy to see. The fiscal path we are on today is simply not sustainable. This debt and these deficits that we are incurring on an annual basis are like a cancer, and they are truly going to destroy this country from within unless we have the common sense to do something about it. This is a problem we're going to have to face up to in maybe 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But if our bankers over there in Asia begin to believe that we're not going to be solid on our debt, that we're not going to be able to meet our obligations, just stop and think for a minute what happens if they just stop buying our debt. What happens to interest rates? And what happens to the U.S. economy? The markets will absolutely devastate us if we don't step up to this problem. The problem is real, the solutions are painful, and we have to act.
What I tell people is very simple, and people in America are way ahead of all of you. They know what's going on, because when you say, why don't you go back and think what people are doing at their kitchen table? I'll tell you what they're doing at their kitchen table. They know that if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And they know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And they've got it figured out that this government is stupid. To borrow 40 cents for every buck you spend, forget the charts, forget the GDP, all the rest of it. That's where we are.
I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. Let me just tell you how crazy our situation is today. We have this treaty where we're supposed, if China were to attack Taiwan, we're supposed to support Taiwan. The only problem is we have to borrow the money from China in order to do it. You know, this is a real mess we're in today. And we can either take the ostrich theory and put our heads in the sand, or we can decide we're going to step up and do something about it. But I can tell you, bankers aren't going to continue to finance something that they aren't sure they're going to get paid back. And the less sure they are, the more they're going to charge you at first, and then they're going to cut you off. And we're borrowing half of our money from foreign countries.
So, first of all,
your typical Tea Party or Occupy members. These are not hyperbolic folks. But he said we have 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, until the most predictable economic crisis in history. We're already a year into that. Now, if you hit the next slide, this is David Walker. David Walker was the former Comptroller General of the United States, the former Chief Auditor of the United States, and about 4 weeks ago, he spoke to a group of about 600 state legislators. And he said, look, if we don't immediately reform entitlements, cut spending, increase revenues, we have about 3 years until we face a total fiscal meltdown. And then he said, you states that get 30 to 50% of your budget from the federal government, you've seen the high water mark. It's only down from here. It's just a matter of math at this point. This isn't politics. This is simply math. And so that's where we are. And so looking at that tremendous situation, how do we plug a $5.2 billion hole? Particularly, I can't remember, Bob, we were talking that 50% of our state budget is education funding. And so any hit to that $5.2 billion is going to affect education worse than anything else, because the highest percentage of our tax revenues and of our budget goes to education. So what do we do there? I mean, we simply can't tolerate that, where we're in a situation that our greatest challenge and our greatest resource is this youngest population per capita in the nation. Sometimes we think, oh, we've got so many kids. Well, the opposite of that is, oh, we've got so many kids. When New York and Illinois and California and countries around the world are retiring their baby boomers, we've got a resource unlike anything else. If we educate and train them properly, that will be our Social Security. That will be our economic security. If we don't, it'll be a tremendous liability. There's our choice. Now, great challenges make for great opportunity. So that's where we are. How do we plug that hole? Go ahead and hit the next slide, if you will. So now we get into the meat of what we need to talk about. In this slide, the blue represents the privately owned land in the United States. Notice a difference there. Pretty stark, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? Now here's what's really incredible about this. Do you know the difference in the terms of statehood between all those states to the east of Colorado and the states to the west of Colorado? The difference in the essential terms of statehood is the date. The promises, the material terms of statehood are the same. North Dakota, Kansas, Missouri, the promises at statehood, the material terms of statehood are the same. The only difference is the performance. Hit the next slide. Go ahead and go past that one. We already covered that. So think about North Dakota. Do you know what's going on in North Dakota right now? They're paying $20 an hour at McDonald's. They've got money coming out of their ears to educate their children. They have effectively zero unemployment because they control their land. They're on the right side of that arbitrary line of terms of statehood where they were complied with rather than where they weren't. It's the only difference. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So we've got this so here's the question. Where is the line then in educating our children adequately, in unleashing full employment, and most particularly the security, the sustainability of our state going forward? These are tremendous issues. Can you imagine losing $5.2 billion of our state budget when all of the advisors to state government are telling us that's going away, either quickly or slowly? But we know, because of the tremendous debt and deficit situation of the federal government, those federally sourced funds are going away to one degree or another. So it takes tremendous preparation. Go ahead and hit the next slide, please. So here's this arbitrary line. The promises are the same. The only difference is the performance. Now look what's really interesting, because what a lot of people say is they say, you states in the West, you're just different. Well, why? Look at Hawaii. Hawaii is as west as you go. Hawaii controls virtually 100% of its land. Federal government just gave it. Didn't sell it, just gave it to the state of Hawaii. They did it with Tennessee as well, by the way. They just said, here's your land. But somehow we're conditioned to think Western states are different. And we don't ask the question why. Promises are the same. The only difference is the performance. This is what Utah looks like topographically. Do you know that in the southeast quarter of Utah, there's $2 trillion in mineral resources? $2 trillion in mineral resources. Right now, I just talked to a good friend, right now there are more than 2,000 lease applications, mineral lease applications just sitting on a bureaucrat's desk that represent more than $2 billion in annual revenue to the state of Utah. They're just sitting there. Think of what $2 billion would do in improving education. What we've been doing to date, and you know this, Bob, very well, what we've been doing to date in education is we say, you know what, we got a $12 billion budget and I got $1 in this pocket, I wonder if I can move it over to this pocket. And then I can tell you, hey, I increased the WPU. Aren't you happy? Now I took this $1 out of the flexible spending account, and so the money that goes to pay for your retirement, you've got to make that $1 up somewhere else, but I put it in the WPU, the weighted pupil unit. That's what we've been doing. We've been reshuffling scarce dollars. We've been trying to chop up scarce dollars differently without increasing the pie. And we see the results. We continue to be dead last in the nation in per pupil funding. Well, how long are we going to tolerate that? How long as a legislature, how long as a citizenry, when we have the resource, if you'll hit the next slide, when we have the resource, if we have the will? It's in our hands, it's in our power, it's in our ability, it's there. We can pretend that we're going to divide those scarce dollars somehow. We can pretend that we can tax the rich, but we're at this delicate balance. Did you read the paper today on Illinois, right? Illinois increased taxes 66% last year. Guess what? Revenues went down. Their deficit got bigger. They still have an $8.5 billion deficit. There's a delicate balance to where employers won't come anymore. Businesses won't bring business there anymore when the taxes get too high. People won't come. We're at a very delicate balance that we've got this nice sweet spot in our taxation in Utah. We've got businesses coming, creating new jobs at a much better rate than the national average. If we decide we just go tax the rich, well, we completely upset that delicate balance. We end up getting less revenues. That's been proven time and time again. We have the resource if we have the will. According to our legislative fiscal analysts, there are smart guys that crunch the numbers for us at the legislature and make us look really good. PILT. Do you know what PILT is? PILT is payment in lieu of taxes. Part of being a state and having control of our land is the right to tax the land. That's part of the sovereign right of a state. To tax the land, to generate funds, to educate children, to pay for public services. Well, because the federal government controls 70% of our land, and in 1976 we'll talk about some things that they did, it's called the FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, where the federal government just said, even though we made these promises, the same as North Dakota and Oklahoma and the rest, we made the promises to transfer title to that land at your statehood, because we decided not to do that, or we've been delaying on that, we're going to give you PILT, payment in lieu of the taxes that you could be getting from your land. Well, PILT is about $34 million. If we were able to tax the land as it exists now, even Greenbelt as it is, it'd be almost $250 million in difference. We've been laboring under that now for 116 years, where we've not had the ability to tax the land as the other states, like the North Dakotas and the Kansas and the Oklahomas, and we get PILT, which is some morsels off the table. Here, just be quiet. Here's PILT. Just take that and be quiet. That's what we've been getting. And in fact, because of the budget issues, PILT is getting less and less and less. It's kind of arbitrary. We'll give you what we feel like giving you, enough to keep you quiet. That's what that is. Now, the value of these public lands, excluding the national parks, is about $22 billion as they exist right now. If the lands had been transferred, as they promised all the other states, and as they did to all the states to the eastern edge of Colorado, the value of those lands, if they had developed like similarly situated lands in the county, would be about $350 billion. Just the property tax alone would double our state budget, let alone the mineral lease monies and all the rest that are there. Just the property tax revenue would nearly double our state budget. Now we're talking about moving the needle. Now we're talking about not just taking scarce dollars and reshuffling them somehow and trying to come out with some nice PR statement to say, look what we did for education every year, which is where we've been. This is what the percentage of federal ownership looks like across the whole United States. 64.5% federally owned in Utah, 83% in Nevada. Now here's a modest proposal. Go ahead and click this. Let's trade places for a little while. Let's let the federal government own 52% of the eastern states and see how well that works out. I imagine we'll get a different debate. So here's where the history gets really fascinating. We have to know our history if we're going to understand what the full scope of our rights are. Let's go back to 1780. 1780, we're in the middle of a war. 13 colonies, right? We need help from the Dutch, we need help from the French. They said, we want to deal with one entity. We don't want to deal with 13 of you. We need you to speak with one voice. And so they said, okay, we need to confederate somehow. And they're trying to figure out what form to get together, to confederate. And Maryland steps up and says, hey, wait a minute, time out. All of you other states control all of these western lands. They called them the western wastelands. Maryland didn't have any claim to western lands. They were this landlocked little state. They said, if we throw in with you, we're landlocked. We're going to be dwarfed in this confederation. We're not doing it. We're not going there. And that almost undermined any confederation from the very beginning. It was the first great impasse that our nation dealt with in this process of confederating. New York stepped up. Go ahead and hit the next, go through the next pieces of that slide. There should be a couple more clicks. New York stepped up and they said, okay, here's what we'll do to break the impasse. We'll transfer bare title to our western lands to this to-be confederated government on two express trust conditions. The first is that you only use that land to create new states. And in fact, their language was, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. And in fact, all the other states, when they ceded their land to the confederated government, used that exact same language. There were two different resolutions of Congress in doing this. The first one in September of 1780, they said, no, that's not specific enough. You need to do that again and be much more specific. And so on October 10th, 1780, the resolution was very, very specific. These lands will only be used to create new states, and the proceeds of selling those lands will only be used to pay the national public debt. And that was the terms of this expressed trust. They called it a solemn compact. They called it a bilateral agreement, and we'll look at that a little bit more. But Congress and money being what they are, 50 years go by, and Congress says, hey, we're selling these lands to create new states because that's what we're supposed to do, but there's some money there. Let's take that money and we'll do something else with it besides pay the debt, because that's no fun. And so they went to take the money to do something else. It goes up to President Jackson, and President Jackson says, wait a minute, guys, you don't get where we came from. Oh, go ahead and click through to the next slide. President Jackson says, look, these were solemn compacts. They originated before the Constitution, and they're the very basis on which we even got to a Constitution. We wouldn't have done it otherwise. And they bind the United States by a course of policy, by ties as strong as can be invented to secure the faith of nations. Think of that language. Solemn trust language. This land is being held in trust to create new states. Now let's step back for a second and think about this. I always like to kind of look at the purpose and where we came from and why did they do that. Think about where we came from. We fought a war against a land baron. That's what King George was. If I control the land, I control the people. I control the land, I can put troops in your house, I can do whatever I want. If I control the land, I control you. And I can give the land to some of my feudal buddies, and they control the land and they control you. Does it make any sense at all, after securing independence from that our Constitution would open the door even a crack to allow for a federal land baron? Go like this. Of course not, right? Of course not. And in fact, it doesn't. Under Article 1, Section 817 of the Constitution, there are 3 requirements for the federal government to own land. Now, first we say you can have 10 square miles, the District of Columbia, for the seat of government. You can have that. But if you're going to own any other land, because we don't want a land baron, we fought a war to get away from that. If you're going to own any other land, number 1, you've got to purchase it. Number 2, you have to get the consent of the state legislature. And number 3, it can only be for forts, batteries, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Because we don't want a land baron. We went through a very precious price to get away from that. Right? Makes sense? But we kind of get this language of federal land. Oh, it's federal land. Well, okay. No, look at where we came from. Look at where we came from. Look at what the rights and the authorities delegated under the Constitution are. So, the Supreme Court over the years, and we could talk about the history on this thing for days. The history is so rich and so replete with this solemn trust, these solemn compacts. Go ahead and hit the next slide. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Supreme Court in 1845, U.S. Supreme Court, said, once the United States shall have fully executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the new states will be complete. They'll have all their land, and they'll have control over all their land. They can tax their land throughout their respective borders. And they and the original states will be upon an equal footing in all respects whatsoever. Doesn't that make sense? Does it make any sense that North Dakota should be different than Utah just because they happen to fall on the right side of an arbitrary line? Of course not. And it was never intended to be that way. Now, there's still been that argument floating out, that completely unsubstantiated argument that you states in the West are just different somehow. Well, the Supreme Court addressed that as well. And they addressed it right at the very time that our Enabling Act was being drafted. 1894 they drafted the Enabling Act. 1896, it was approved and we became a state. At the very time they're doing that, the Supreme Court says, it doesn't matter if these lands come to the federal government by cession. That was our history with New York, right, and the other states. By treaty, by discovery, or settlement. Those lands are held in trust for the several states ultimately to be created out of the territory. Right? I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? That's why the federal government was holding land. Have any of you ever been a trustee of a trust? Do you know how that works? Melissa, let's suppose you're the trustee for your nieces and nephews. And your sister says, you're going to hold title to the house. It's going to be in your name. The tax notices are going to come to Melissa. But they're not taxing you, right? They're taxing the house. It's going to come to your name. Now, you control everything as if it were yours. And so the children don't know any different. They don't know the terms of the trust. And when they turn 18, you just say, hey, here's $1,000 each. See you later. It's my house, right? No, why not?
It's not mine.
It's not yours. It's not yours. You have a solemn duty to dispose of it, to transfer it on the conditions, right? Solemn trusts. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So this is the language of our Enabling Act. It says the same thing. Now, in the first couple of sentences, it says, we're going to forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated land to the United States. Well, some people have said, hey, you gave it all up. Well, guess what? So did North Dakota. So did Kansas, so did Oklahoma, so did all the other states. Because what that's doing, have any of you been involved in real estate transactions? When you're doing real estate transactions, sometimes there's interests in land that you just don't know where the interests end. Somebody might have a particular interest, a lease, or who knows what. And so you'll get quit claims to clean up all the title, to make sure that once you transfer title, there's no one else that has a superior claim to title. Same thing. All the states did the same thing. So when they were created as states, they said, okay, we're going to give all title to you, not jurisdiction. That's a very critical distinction. We're going to give right and title to you as trustee. And guess what? So that when you do dispose of the land, when you do transfer title as you promised with all the states, there's no superior claim to title. There's no question about title. And then guess what? The United States says, we're going to promise, like they did with all the states, the same promise, we're going to extinguish title. We're going to dispose of the title. We're going to transfer it out because we're not supposed to be a land baron. We're going to transfer that title out. And guess what? The state of Utah says, so long as you are timely transferring title as you're supposed to do as a trustee, we're not going to tax the land. We're going to suspend our sovereign right to tax the land while you're disposing of it. Do you see in there anywhere where the state of Utah said, you never extinguish title to the land, therefore we can never tax the land? Does that make any sense? Go like this. I mean, of course not. We would never have agreed to that, and in fact, we did not agree to that, nor did any of the western states, nor did any of the other states. What was happening at the time with North Dakota and with Kansas and with Oklahoma, they were in the process of disposing of the land. And so when we made our deal, we're looking at the federal government saying, oh, okay, we're going to agree they're going to extinguish title. They're going to do it in a timely fashion because we can see them doing it. And the second they dispose of it, to the extent they dispose of it, guess what? We get to tax the land so we can educate our children, so we can provide public services. That's the way it had worked all the way through. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on the federal government, at least at this point. Because what they ran into a geography problem. Right? They're coming west from the original colonies, and you've got this rich Ohio and Missouri where water just percolates up out of the ground, and you can grow crops, and you've got that rich black dirt, and it's just beautiful. And then they get to the west, and they get to this desert that has no water in it, and nobody wants it unless there's water there. And they just run right into that desert wall. Well, they had a practical problem disposing of the land as fast as they did in the other states. But does that take away your duty to transfer the land? Of course not. Of course not. So what happened then? Let's go to the next slide. This is another provision of the Enabling Act. This comes right at you in education, okay? This is in our Enabling Act. Again, these are the promises made at our statehood. 5% of the proceeds of the sale of the public lands, which shall be sold subsequent to the admission of the state, shall be paid to the permanent fund for the benefit of the common schools. Could it be more clear? 5% of the sales of the public lands, which shall be sold subsequent to the admission, shall be paid to the permanent fund for the public schools. Same promise, right? That's the same promise that started in 1780 that came right through all the states. The promises are the same. The only difference is the performance. Supreme Court has called it this. The Supreme Court even recently has called these solemn compacts, bilateral agreements. That means performance is going both ways, that need to be performed in a timely fashion. Now, even in 1934, they have this problem. Nobody wants to buy the land. It's kind of desert, and we don't know there's $2 trillion worth of minerals there at that time. And they said, okay, we're going to manage this. And so they passed the Taylor Grazing Act. And look at the language, the first two sentences. This is to promote the highest use of the public lands pending its final disposal. We still have that duty. We're still just a trustee. We're still holding bare legal title to transfer the land, because that's the promise we've made from 1780 forward until we get to 1976. So nearly 200 years, we get to 1976, and Congress exercises the property law of 2-year-olds. You know the property law of 2-year-olds, right? If it's mine, it's mine. If it's yours, it's mine. If I can see it, it's mine. If it's pretty, it's mine. And that's what we get in the Federal Land Policy Management Act, also known as FLPMA. Look at what they say. It is now the policy of the United States, after 200 years of this unmistakable history, it's now the policy of the United States that the public lands be retained in federal ownership. Well, isn't that nice? You children in Utah, you're just not as good as North Dakota, because we didn't dispose of it fast enough, and so too bad for you. You children in Utah, you businesses in Utah, you're not as good as the businesses in Kansas. You wage earners in Utah, you're certainly not as good as the wage earners in North Dakota. who the businesses are fighting all over themselves to employ you right now, because you happen to fall on the left side of the arbitrary line. Isn't that amazing? Now, what the states, this is where that PILT came in, right? The states at that time said, wait a minute, what are you doing? And they had what they called the Sagebrush Rebellion. And they kind of got up in arms. Well, then Reagan got elected, and they thought, well, our problems are all solved, all our wildest dreams will come true now. And it didn't happen. Once a federal program gets initiated, those hooks get in there, and it never goes away. And it's just gotten bigger and bigger and more control. Even in FLIPMA, they said, oh, don't worry. Under FLIPMA, we're going to manage these lands the way you want them managed. We manage these public lands for you. And we're going to manage the multiple use to get sustained yields from the land. Well, how well is that working out? Just last week, did you read the news? Just last week, without any notice, communication, coordination, cooperation with the state, Department of Interior came in and said, we're going to tie up 40% of the uranium resources in the United States. We're just going to lock it up. We're going to lock it up for 20 years, throw away the key. That's Arizona, but guess what? All the people that work there live in Fredonia and Kanab. The processing of that uranium happens in San Juan and in other areas of Utah with a stroke of a pen. Sound like a land baron? Guess what happened almost a year ago, Christmas Eve? About 11 o'clock, our governor gets a call from Bob Abbey, the head of the Bureau of Land Management. He says, Governor, just want to let you know we're having a press conference in an hour. We're going to take about 6 million acres of your land, and we're just going to tie it up. We're going to call it wildlands. We just came up with that name. Don't you like that? We're just going to tie it up. The governor said, so why are you calling me? What, can I do anything about this? He says, no, we just thought you'd like to know. Land baron? What about the promise? What about that solemn promise? Promises are the same. The only difference is the performance. Here's where it gets good. So for 30 years we've been fighting that battle, and I'll tell you, in state government, we fight that battle every single day. Every committee hearing, every budget hearing. We're now suing the federal government over 10,000 roads. We've had roads that have been roads from before our statehood. You know, ranchers and access and all the rest. And they come in and just say, yeah, we're shutting those roads down. Yeah, we know you've been getting to that property from this road for 50, 60, 100 years, but we're shutting it down. We have to file lawsuits to do that. We've got all sorts of things where we're dealing with that issue of a land baron. If I control the land, I control you. We're spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars just on access issues to our land. Right now. The Sitla lands, right? At our statehood, we didn't show this in the Enabling Act, but at our statehood, they said, okay, certain parcels of land, and I should remember the numbers, but it's like 1 and 16 and 32, and it's this weird checkerboard. You've seen it, right? It's this weird checkerboard. In the sections of land, they take these checkerboard parcels and say, okay, for your school fund, your state institutional trust lands, we're going to give you these checkerboard parcels. Well, think about property law, right? Think about owning property. Suppose you've got a 1/4 of an acre here, and a 1/4 of an acre here, and a 1/4 of an acre down here, and a 1/4 of an acre over here. You've got an acre of land, right? Isn't that great? You got an acre of land. Think of what you could do on an acre of land. How much would you pay for that versus over here, a full acre of land? Right? That's what's happening on our Sitla lands. And so it's estimated, Kevin Carter, who's the head of the director for Sitla in the state of Utah, estimates we're losing somewhere on the order of $100 million a year, even on the lands that were transferred to us at statehood. Because we can't access them or we can't consolidate them. Because we've got a land baron working right now. So this is where it gets really good, okay? We've been battling that battle for nearly 35 years now. 2009, middle of 2009, the United States Supreme Court, unanimous decision of this U.S. Supreme Court, Hawaii versus Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Let me give you just a little bit of the background on this, okay? 1893, industrial powers come in and they dethrone the king and the royal family. They take all the land, they give it to the federal government. Native Hawaiians were not pleased, understandably. 1959, we make Hawaii a state and we say, you know what? Take all your land. Nothing. We're not even going to charge anything, just take it all. Remember, they did that to Tennessee as well. Take all your land. Native Hawaiians are still not happy. And in Hawaii, they have what's called the Office of Hawaiian Affairs that looks out for the Native Hawaiian interests. 1993, Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii runs an apology resolution in Congress. The apology resolution goes something like this. Whereas, now therefore we apologize to the Native Hawaiians, and nothing in this apology resolution shall deny or disparage the claims of the Native Hawaiians against the federal government. Right? So Hawaii goes to sell some of its land. Office of Hawaiian Affairs comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, not so fast. You can't sell that land unless you impress it with a lien based on this subsequent act of Congress, this apology resolution. The state of Hawaii says, it doesn't affect us. Office of Hawaiian Affairs takes him to district court in the state of Hawaii. District court says, that doesn't affect the state of Hawaii. They appeal to the Hawaiian Supreme Court. Hawaiian Supreme Court says, oh, yes, it does. You can't sell that land unless you impress it with a lien based on this subsequent act of Congress, notwithstanding your admission and your rights and your promises at statehood. Goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Alito writes the opinion for the unanimous Supreme Court. Look at their language. This is phenomenal. This subsequent act of Congress raises grave constitutional concerns if it purports to cloud their title to their sovereign lands more than 3 decades after their admission. And then look at this language. The consequences of admission are instantaneous, and it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what's already been bestowed. And then look at that last statement. And this proposition applies with even greater force where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Think about that. Subsequent acts of Congress, like FLIPMA, can't change the vested rights of a state's enabling act. Doesn't that make perfect sense? Melissa, the trustee, can't come in and say, I make myself queen of the home forever. No, that agreement was made. Your sister passed away. That is now irrevocable. That's what sovereignty is. That's what the sovereignty of statehood is. Irrevocable promises. That's what the Supreme Court just said. Isn't that? I mean, that's incredible. Now, this is just within the last 2 years. So we have a door open that is amazing. Now, let's just, in terms of what they said, the uniquely sovereign character of our admission. Hit that next slide, if you would. Let's just look at what those rights are, the uniquely sovereign rights of our statehood. Go ahead and just click through these. Number 1, dispose of all the land. Transfer the land. That was your promise. And do it in a timely fashion. Pay 5% of the proceeds for the permanent fund for education. Now we can tax the land. We promised to temporarily suspend our right to tax while you timely dispose. Remember, we never promised that you never dispose, therefore we can never tax. We never would have made that promise, and nor did we. And then once you do that, we have sovereign control of our land. No more Christmas Eve surprises and that sort of thing, right? We have sovereign control of the land. That was the uniquely sovereign character of our admission. Okay, so you're asking, what do we do about it? What does that mean? So here's what we do. The Supreme Court invited us to take a uniquely sovereign act. If sovereignty means anything, it means not having to say, Mother, may I? It means not having to say, pretty please. It means we're in this relationship as governing partners and not this relationship as a subordinate subdivision. That we're as sovereign and supreme in our respective sphere as they are sovereign and supreme in their respective sphere of the limited powers delegated to the federal government. If sovereignty means anything, it means not having to say, Mother, may I? So in taking a uniquely sovereign act, we simply tell the federal government, we can't wait any longer. It's been 116 years. You've had 116 years to fulfill your promise like you did with North Dakota, like you did with Oklahoma, like you did with all points east, and oh, by the way, like you did with Hawaii in the west. It's not just a western state thing. You've had 116 years. Our children can't wait any longer, being dead last in per pupil funding. Our teachers can't wait any longer, being overworked and underpaid. Our businesses can't wait any longer to unleash the economic opportunity that secures our future. Our wage earners can't wait any longer to have the opportunity for higher paying jobs. Our state and our people can't wait any longer to provide for the long-term sustainability of our state when we know, because of federal government, your wonderful financial management, $5.2 billion of our state budget is going away. So what we do is we set a deadline. It's been 116 years, you have 2 more years. You have until December 31st. Go ahead and click through the next slides. Yeah, go ahead and just click through a few of those. You have until December 31st, 2014 to transfer the land directly to the state, like you did to Hawaii and like you did to Tennessee. Now in doing that, we have you transfer the land to a Public Lands Commission, just like Texas does and just like Hawaii does. And in the Public Lands Commission, we receive that land and we manage it for the multiple use of the land. And in doing that, we preserve the open space and the access and the right to responsibly develop that $2 trillion resource, because that's our land. That's the responsibility and the opportunity that we have. In the Public Lands Commission, open process, public process, to the extent that the Public Lands Commission determines in a public process to dispose of, to privatize the land, if any, then that's done by a public process to the highest bidder. 5% of the proceeds go to the public schools. That's the deal in our Enabling Act. 95% of the proceeds go to pay the national public debt. That's our deal. Now the land's available for taxation. Now it's available for economic development. Now it's available for deployment. Now it's available as a resource to increase the economic pie in our state, like North Dakota. Now, in thinking about this, I don't want to be misunderstood in any way of saying we're going to wholesale off all the land. We can't do that. Because think about what's happened. If we were in 1896, no problem. 1896, we don't have any vested rights hanging out there. We don't have all of these expectations that have developed over 116 years. If we're in 1896 and they're timely disposing of the land, no problem. But that's not us. We're not there. Over 116 years, we've developed as people that love our open space. We love access to our lands. We love to recreate on the lands. We love our national parks. We would also love to educate our children and have money to do that and utilize our resource responsibly. That's what the Public Lands Commission will do. Utahns managing Utah resources, Utah lands for the best interest of Utah. That was the promise. What if they don't? I'm sure you're saying, federal government, I'm sure they're just going to sign that over right away once we do this. What if they don't? Actually, let me take one step before we get to that. Once we set that deadline, look at what we do to our congressional delegation. I was just meeting with Senator Lee yesterday, Rob Bishop, Congressman Bishop yesterday, meeting with Senator Hatch's staff today. Think of what we do when we set the deadline. We tee that up for them in Washington to have a meaningful national debate on how we work together as governing partners. That's the first hope. We've got 2 years to try to work this out as governing partners and figure out the best way to transfer that land, to fulfill your duty, to fulfill that promise in a workable manner. If you don't, in that first opportunity, we tax the land. Remember, that's our sovereign right. That's the inherent nature of sovereignty. If sovereignty means anything, it means not having to say, "Mother, may I?" We tax the land. If you don't pay the tax, we lien the land. You don't satisfy the lien, we execute the lien. We're happy to work with you, but we can't wait any longer. You've had 116 years to fulfill your promise, like you did with all the states east of Colorado and with Hawaii. Our children are certainly as good as their children. Our people, our wage earners, our businesses are certainly as good as theirs. It's time for you to fulfill those promises. So some of the things that we do, if you'll click through the next slide and then get to the one following. Right here. So in doing this, we take the national parks off the table. They're not at issue. The Indian lands, they're not at issue. Those were never granted. Those were reserved exclusively out in the Enabling Act. Those are off the table. But in the national parks, what we do is we do similar to what California did. Now remember, again, the property law of 2-year-olds, the federal government never came to us and said, "This is pretty, we're going to buy it, we're going to get your consent, and it's for forts, batteries, dockyards, or other needful buildings," Article 1, Section 817. They didn't do that. But nevertheless, these are national parks that we all appreciate. We're going to take our legislative act and preserve those. But we're going to do it like California did. When California ceded Yosemite National Park to the national government, they did it conditionally, on condition that they reserve taxation of the concessions in the park, civil and criminal service of process and jurisdiction, hunting and fishing permits, and certain things like that. Some of the conditions we look at are very similar to the ones that California did. In addition, we look at you won't encumber the national parks. You're the world's greatest debtor. We don't want you encumbering those parks. We don't want you transferring them to anyone else. Right now, what the federal government is doing, we have a boundary to the national parks, but as an extension of the property law of 2-year-olds, they're saying, oh, we need a buffer zone. So here's the boundary, but we need another 20 miles beyond the boundary. So one of the conditions would be the boundary is the boundary. Perhaps one of the conditions may be that we reserve subsurface mineral rights. Now with the technology we have, we can certainly go in and utilize resources that are there without disturbing the national parks. So those are some of the conditions that are being contemplated in that. But as far as national parks, we take those off the table. And so that's in essence the bill. Now, in addition to the bill, we're going to run a resolution. In our legislation, we don't put flowery language and whereas, now, therefore, and this is why we're doing that. Our language is very, very straightforward. So what we do in addition to the bill is we want to run a resolution along with the bill that goes through this history, that talks about the promises that were made, that go back to the very before the foundation of our Constitution, as President Jackson said, originated before the Constitution and formed the very basis upon which we even had a Constitution. Bind the United States by a course of policy, by ties as strong as can be invented to secure the faith of nations. And so we lay that out as well. Let me just tell you, we have 5 Western states running this same legislation. We have legislators in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, all running this legislation together. The legislation has been approved by the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a national organization of about 3,000 state legislators. We had 4 different public hearings on this, or 4 different hearings rather, at our conference last month. It was approved unanimously by the public sector as national model legislation. Senator Lee has been helping and working with us on the language, and he actually made this statement when I was visiting with him yesterday. He said, in a situation like this, when you're creating this, number one, to take the uniquely sovereign act, but now you're in a position that the federal government would have to sue you rather than going to play Mother May I. He says, where you go to the Supreme Court, if it goes there, now we're hopeful that we can work things out as governing partners having set the deadline. That's our first hope. But if it goes there, Senator Lee said, your odds increase 5-fold if you go to the Supreme Court as a defendant rather than as a plaintiff, where they have to come and sue you. The odds increase 5-fold. I think I mentioned we've been to the State School Board, the Superintendent's Association, the PTA, Counties Association, a variety of other groups. This is getting tremendous attention. The head of the Natural Resources Committee, Roger Barris, Representative Barris, has been working very, very diligently on this. Representative Handy, Senator Niederhauser, who's in Senate leadership, is the co-sponsor on this bill. We've got representatives far and wide. Representative Noel, who has been so tremendous on lands issues. Representative Harrod and Sumption, who have been so tremendous on lands issues. Representative Brown, who have laid the history on lands issues. Understand that we can't wait. You've had 116 years. Our children can't wait. Our teachers can't wait. Our wage earners can't wait. Our businesses, the people in our state can't wait to secure the long-term sustainability of our state. And so, what we need from you, this is a tremendous opportunity. This is a bold step. This is not reshuffling scarce dollars. This is moving the needle in a material way to secure the long-term sustainability of our state. If liberty being a personal responsibility means anything, it's time to mobilize. It's time to mobilize and let your representatives know, if you're supportive of this, it's time to take these actions. Now, your representative is on board. Your Senator, Osmond, is on board. Governor needs to hear from you. Other representatives need to hear from you. Your neighbors need to know that there's a tremendous opportunity to have those same promises that were fulfilled to all the other states that are the same promises to be fulfilled in Utah. There's a tremendous opportunity to do that, and so I hope you will take that opportunity to stand up. These are exciting times, like we started out. If you can't get excited about the times we're in now, you really need to check your pulse. I'm so grateful that you came tonight. I'm so grateful that you took time to come and do this. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be engaged in this because I have 4 children. As much as your children are important, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this, I care about them deeply. I can't imagine what Senator Lee said about a month ago or so as we were working on this. He said, where we have the resources, where we have the opportunity, where the promises are so clear, the only thing missing is our standing in our stewardship to act. We'll stand to account for our children continuing one more day last in per pupil funding. We'll stand to account for not having that sustainable future in our state. And I think that means all of us. So it's time to go forward. Thank you so very much for your time. Thank you very much for being here. Be happy to take questions.
Is there anything to keep the federal government from making more federal parks and stuff in this 2-year period?
No, just like they did with Escalante, right? They didn't bother to consult with us, just like they did with the uranium last week. Now, the only thing that would keep that, to the extent that they do something spiteful, because we take this step, we could certainly go to court and move for injunctive relief. And again, we've got a court now that we have a number of 9-0 opinions on very substantial federalism governing partnership relations. And so, yeah, if they were to take some spiteful action, number one, where you've got 5 states, and in addition to the 5 states, we've got national organizations, Americans for Tax Reform, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Freedom Works, State Policy Network, all having discussions and messaging this as a way to deal with some of our national issues. If they were to do something spiteful like that, the outcry, the national debate would only be ratcheted up that much more.
Do you have one more question? Do you have a sample letter or something we could send out to our community councils to forward on to the governor and their legislature? Yes,
as a matter of fact, I just gave it to Sherry to proofread for me.
Okay.
And so we'll have that ready in a couple days. We're also, thanks to Bob, we're shooting some video and making this available so you can take this presentation. We'll try to condense it as much as we can so we don't put people through the misery of listening to me for an hour. But we can condense it down into smaller YouTube-sized bites and share that around and get that going virally. And so that's one of the best ways we can do that. So we'll have a letter. We're gonna build a website. We're still working on the name. I mean, maybe I can get your help on this, but we're looking at something like, we can't wait to prosper. We can't wait to, something like that, and do a website so we can post all the information. We can post the status of how the legislation is going in the other states, post information about the economic analysis and some of this history that we've talked about, those sorts of things.
I'm just going to ask about what the status is and whether in the current legislative body is there a lot of support for it, or are we lacking in support?
No, it's tremendous. In fact, Representative Barras, who's the head of the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, he expects that this will have veto-proof majorities in the House and the Senate.
Do you expect a veto?
No, I sure hope not. No, I don't think so. I don't think so, but the fact that we can pass it that overwhelmingly, this is a big step though. And if you think about the governor, this is a big step to take this action. And so to the extent that you can email and get to the governor and give him courage and say, as a people, we would like you to lead on this, that would be tremendous. It's always good. I mean, I'll tell you, as representatives, it's hard because there will be controversy on this. There will be groups that will stand up loud and oppose this. I mean, we expect that, maybe who knows, but there may be opposition and there may be some controversy on this because it is a big, bold step. Anytime you can give your representatives courage, even the smallest little email, the smallest note, the smallest, the quickest phone call and say, hey, we really appreciate you to move forward on this. Those really do mean quite a bit.
What's the time frame for it?
Well, that's a great question. The session starts on Monday. We hope to number the bill, which kind of activates it. We hope to number the bill kind of on Monday or Tuesday and start getting that moving. It'll take some time for them to get the fiscal note, you know, what they think this will cost. But then we start moving through into committee hearings. We'll have hearings in the House, hearings in the Senate. And what we'll do, to the extent we'll pass a list, and if you want to be on a notification list, we'll notify you of those committee hearings, and you're welcome. And in fact, I encourage you to show up. I encourage you to get your PTA out to show up at those hearings, to bring anyone out that you can, your school community councils out to those hearings to express your support. And it's really kind of fascinating. If you've never been there and done that, it's a great thing to be involved in. So yeah, we'll keep you notified on all that.
So what is the cost? And once we get those lands, how much is it going to cost? Like, how much is it going to cost out of our state budget then to manage those lands?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the first question is, how much does it cost if we do nothing? We know that answer. We know that with almost certainty. Erskine Bowles told us, David Walker told us, every advisor to state government has told us $5.2 billion is substantially at risk. So we know that cost. Now, in terms of the actual cost of moving forward, the fiscal analysts will look at what does it take to establish the Public Lands Commission, what might it take to reserve for litigation if we were to be sued. One of the things that we set up in legislation that I ran last year, this one I was telling you about, the Federal Law Evaluation and Response Bill, we were able to allocate $1 million a year of ongoing money from what they call the mineral lease bonus account. So on these mineral lease, the mineral leases that come, there's royalties that come to the states, and there's all sorts of pots and pools of money that come to the state. Well, we were able to find an unallocated source of money that is federal money that we receive from the federal government to use to wage this response to the federal government. So that's already been allocated. It's already $1 million a year. We're already authorized to be able to use that to hire outside attorneys if need be. It's already there. In terms of the cost of public lands commissions and those sorts of things, the beauty of this is the only real substantive action we take this legislative session is setting the deadline. Then we pass the ball, we pass the torch to our congressional delegation. If they do their job and they stand up with 5 states and the clamor of Western states, and not just Western states, we've got Eastern states saying it's time. It's time to North Dakota-ize the Western states, given the nature of the economy that we're in. Just lost where I was going.
Delegations.
Oh, right. So if they do their job, so we pass that ball, thank you. So we pass that ball to them. If they do their job and we can act like governing partners, we never get there. In fact, we never even get to the deadline. That's what we're hoping for. I mean, that's what our system is, right? We have every right to expect that they're going to act like a governing partner and not like a land baron and not like a, this subordinate subdivision idea. So that's the first step. If we get down the road, again, what Senator Lee said, we much rather be going in the position as a defendant rather than a plaintiff.
So then once we get to that point though too, what sort of regulations are in place to protect the land? Because like, I have a cabin in Duchesne, and we go up there, and all we hear the whole time we're up there is oil wells pumping. Right. And I don't, that's not pretty. It's, and so there, yeah, a lot of it is just desert yuck. Right. But there's a lot of it that is beautiful. And then too, when you talked about we're going to manage it like California. Now I don't know a whole. Yeah,
that was just in terms of the grant of the national parks, right?
I know, but this, and I don't know dates or as much of the history of this as I should. Right. But I know that California took a portion of Yosemite National Park, turned it into a dam, and ruined the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And so what's to say we're not going to do that down in and expand Lake Powell or expand. Yeah. Because we're following California's model. Well, California screwed that up. Yeah,
the California model is simply in the fact that when they ceded the national parks, they did it conditionally. That's the beginning and the end of the California model, right? We're going to say, we're going to take the national parks off the table, but we're going to do it conditionally, okay? But to the rest of your question, what's to say that Utah's not going to rape and pillage the land and open strip mine the land, right? I mean, that if we want to take it to an absurd extreme, right? Okay? So that's the nature of government. That's the nature of a PTA. That's the nature of a school community council. Does it make sense that Arkansas is trusted with all its land? They fulfilled the promise to Oklahoma and Minnesota and Arkansas, and they're managing their land, right? We're often, very often referred to as the best managed state in the nation. And so in a public process that's transparent and open, yeah, there's going to be a lot of decisions. Now, there'll be some people that don't like some of the decisions that are made, but that's the nature of a public process. So, you know, there will be people that will come out and say, oh, they're going to put a pipe under the Delegate Arch and start pumping oil. Well, first of all, no, we're going to take the national parks off the table. Second of all, this goes through a public process, and we live here. The nature of who we are in Utah is access, is open space, is recreation, is grazing and ranching and mining, yes, and responsible deployment of our minerals. And so that's the nature of a public process. And as you're seeing, as a state, we balance our budget. We work.
Do we have in place already in this state regulations for that? Like, not federal regulations, because I know there are federal regulations.
Right.
But do we have state, you know, do we have some, your public lands commission?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So again, looking at the process, the first thing we do is set a deadline. And so from the time we set the deadline, now we have a whole year until the next legislative session to do just that, because we don't have the land yet, right? So we have a whole year to work on what we do and get input from cabin owners and ranchers and hunters and fishers and open space and all of the rest. So we spend that year building what that Public Lands Commission is going to look like and how it's going to operate, so that by the time we do receive the land, hopefully working it as governing partners, we're ready to do that with that in place.
But I think the difference is then it's our decision rather than people who live in Washington, D.C.
Exactly right.
Lands because we live here. And if we decide that we want to set apart this parcel of land, that we're not going to develop it, we want it to be a state park.
Right, right.
That is our decision because we live here in the state, rather than it being that decision being made by bureaucrats.
Yeah, you know, and that's a great point. Think about Hawaii. Remember the graphic up there? Hawaii is virtually 100% controlled by the state. You ever been to Hawaii? Parks, beaches, right? I mean, precedent's there. So, yeah.
So, is there an idea going around of who will sit on this Public Lands Commission?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, that'll be part of.
I mean, not specifically who, but
well,
is it going to be?
Yes, in some respect. And so the idea right now, we have what's known as the Constitutional Defense Council, and the Constitutional Defense Council is made up of the governor or his designee, the Attorney General or his designee, House and Senate leaders or their designees, the minority leaders and their designees, and a number of the county commissioners are part of this Constitutional Defense Council. So it takes in interest all across the state, rural and urban and, you know, all the rest. And so what we're envisioning right now is that this Constitutional Defense Council will be in charge of designing the Public Lands Commission and designing what happens between now and the next legislative session, and be in charge of coordinating with our congressional delegation on this governing partnership. So that's the idea.
Is it going to be an elected board? Are they going to be elected people that sit on this commission and make these decisions about the public land?
Yeah, that's what we need to design in the next year. So the people that sit on the Constitutional Defense Council right now are all elected officials or their designees, right? So that's what it exists now. And so then, as we design that, there'll be public input on what that should look like. And so then we'll come to the next legislative session and say, okay, what should this be? And again, open process, transparent process. As Utahns for Utahns, Paul, as you're saying, what should this look like? We've got models in Texas already to draw from. We've got models in Hawaii to draw from on what a Public Lands Commission should look like. And so yeah, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do. I mean, this is going to be a 5-year process. This is not a quick fix, nor should it be. I mean, we're 116 years getting here. To wind our way out is going to take some time and some careful thought and some careful analysis. So, yeah, those are great questions. Yes?
So I'm just envisioning this, so in your crystal ball, you know, all of a sudden our state, let's say we're wildly successful with this, and we start bringing in all this new revenue, right? And I see all these other bloated state governments around the country who are upside down, just like the federal government. What kind of, I know a certain amount of this money would be earmarked, obviously, for education.
Right.
But I also see government, state government getting this big because all of a sudden we have more revenues and resources. So how do you?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, because remember what we talked about, government's engineered to grow, unchecked it grows. Well, think of the check. Your check is number one what you've been doing. You plus your 10 neighbors elect someone that you know is not going to just go spend money. And in Utah, we cut taxes when we probably shouldn't have, honestly. You know, the last time when we did the 5% flat tax, now it's worked out very well, again, for that balance, but we did that right at the apex of the incredible times. Now we're in some pretty seriously lean times. You know, I think on balance it was probably still a good move, because we've set a good reputation. Businesses know that Utah has a stable regulatory environment, stable tax environment. We're as conservative as they come. But the ultimate check on that is, you know, you and your 10 neighbors getting out and walking neighborhoods and pounding signs and making phone calls and saying, liberty is a personal responsibility, and I'm going to put someone in there that represents my values. And, you know, in Utah we do a pretty good job at that.
I have a question about so if we allow the federal government to retain the national parks, and you said it would be conditionally, as part of that condition, somewhere that if we're not liking how they're managing that, we can take that back?
Oh, yeah. Yes, thank you. So, excuse me. Yeah, so one of the conditions we're envisioning is, yes, if it's being mismanaged and being run down, we'll figure out how do we work that into a condition. What's happening right now, there's about $9 billion in deferred maintenance on the national parks. And they're subject to the same budgetary conditions, because the national parks are in the general budget. General budget has a $2 trillion structural imbalance. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the things that has been listed, that we look at putting that down as a condition as well. Thank you.
Can you speak to the national fight that lies ahead? You spoke this morning about, you know, now our congressional delegation takes it from here. And
right.
You started to talk about Mike Lee's writing something or preparing a bill.
Yeah, Mike. I mean, yeah, Mike's already talking about, okay, if we pass this, he's already contemplating and visualizing the kind of legislation that gets the federal government working on how to assess the value to pay the tax, or to pay the tax or to dispose, and what the lands are to dispose and what the process would be to dispose, to ramp up the debate. I mean, I love the prospect of Mike Lee in the well of the Senate saying promises are the same, the only difference is the performance. Are our kids not as good as North Dakota's kids? I love the prospect of Senator Hatch making that same argument. Jason Chaffetz, Rob Bishop, hopefully Jim Matheson, I think he'll be there as well. In fact, his father, I've got a book from former Governor Matheson. He was all over these issues. You know, we're hopeful that Congressman Matheson will be right there. The delegations from all the other states. And so we've already got, for example, Dennis Ross is a congressman in Florida. And he's been looking at proposing legislation. He made a call back in March. He said, we've got to dispose of these lands. Where we're this much in debt, and we have a net loss. The federal government has a net loss in all of these federal agents running around all over the land. It's a huge net loss. I think the cost of managing the land is something like $8.6 billion. And they bring in, because they're not managing the lands for a sustainable yield, I think they bring in something like $800 million on $8.6 billion. We already know that just in Utah, we've got 2,000 leases sitting there waiting for approval. That's $2.6 billion a year in ongoing revenue to the state. But, you know, the management is what it is. So yeah, and then think about, you know, the competitive enterprise institutes, the Freedom Works, the state policy networks. They're ready to have an unveiling, a pep rally, if you will, a seminar symposium. Once we pass our legislation, we get our governor and our speaker and our Senate president and legislators, and as many as will come, with the same type of people from the other states, with our congressional delegation, saying, okay, we're passing the torch. You guys are on the clock.
So if I read that right, does that mean that, so the federal government could sell off the land, they take 95% to pay off the national debt, 5% goes to education? I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, what we're calling for, because of, yes and no. Think about the Hawaii and the Tennessee example where they gave the land directly to the state. The reason they did it in Hawaii was because they had all of these entanglements with the native Hawaiians. Well, look at what we have. We're in the same position. We now have 116 years of, we've got rights in access, grazing rights, timber rights, mineral rights, open space rights. If they just go up and say, you know what, we're just going to throw this up in the air and sell it to the highest bidder, I think not only morally, but legally, there's a great injunction lawsuit to say, wait. You can't step over our rights like that. These have vested over a long period of time. So what we're calling for is they dispose of it directly to the state, like they did with Hawaii and Tennessee, and we manage it from there. We commit that to the extent that any of the land is privatized, if any, 5% to the public education fund, 95% to the national public debt. Again, that was our deal.
I just hate to see, I mean, I heard somebody say, well, what if they just sold it to the Chinese to pay off the debt?
Right.
Obviously, that would be a huge conflict of interest.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And so that, and so yes, I mean, we do have all of these vested rights. To do that would throw that completely up in the air, and you know, then we'd really be off on an exciting national debate. But there again, we've seen crazy things where it's not being treated as a governing partnership. It is being treated as, you know, the subordinate subdivision, and we've got work to do. You know, we've disregarded the unprecedented nature of our system for 80 to 100 years. We've acted like dependents, and so we've been treated like dependents. It's time to start acting like partners, if we want to be treated like partners.